Good evening. Welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight we have sad news. Writer, physician, and longtime Fox contributor Charles Krauthammer died today at the age of 68. He leaves behind his beloved wife Robbie, whom he married in 1974, and their son Daniel. Also mourning his death tonight are his many friends at this network and the millions of viewers who knew and loved Charles from watching him every night. And they did. Ask any Fox anchor, who's the person people you meet at the airport ask about the most, and every single one of them will tell you Charles Krauthammer. Fox viewers love Charles, and it wasn't because he pandered to them. He never did that. Sometimes, in fact, he took positions that they disliked or even hated. But viewers not only forgave him for doing that, they seemed to love him more. They could see his brilliance, but they could also feel his sincerity. Charles always said what he thought was true. He was an honest and genuinely decent man, and it shone through. It was not a pose. Charles is also maybe the bravest man I ever met personally. It takes courage to stay cheerful and humane for anyone for 68 years, and doubly so given the remarkable challenges that he faced for the last 44 of those years. But he did it. Charles was totally unintimidated all the way through, brave and clear thinking to the end. What a man. Tonight we want to talk to some of the people who knew him best here at Fox, starting with his friend of many years, Brit Hume, who joins us tonight. Brit, people loved Charles Krauthammer, even people who disagreed with him. What was it about him that they were responding to?
Well, it was a rare combination, Tucker, in the sense that he had this extraordinary intellect, one that all of us sort of admired, and none of us realized, none of us thought we could ever come close to equaling. He was literally in a class by himself. He was one of a kind. And on top of that, he had, for all of the sharpness of his thought and writing and sometimes his language on television, he was extraordinarily kind and gentle. And the combination made you love him. And we did. All of us did. The audience did. You couldn't help it. And you know, you think of what we're doing here tonight, Tucker. We're all feeling sad and sorry, but look, we've been on the air now since 6 o'clock when this news broke, and we're talking about this one subject. And you know, you might say, well, that's because you know he was on Fox and he was our guy. Yeah, that's true. No. But he was a giant of our time and of our trade, and he carried it out to the highest standards. He wrote beautifully. He was careful about his facts. He thought things through, and he conducted himself with extraordinary dignity and grace, and we could all see it and could only aspire to it.
No bitterness, pure humanity. His instincts were so relentlessly decent. I don't think I knew anyone who disliked him.
Now, I know people who, disagreed with him, and they were sometimes annoyed or offended by, the sharpness with which he wrote. People who, for example, were not as sympathetic to Israel as Charles unfailingly was.
Right.
But on a personal level, and if you ever saw him or watched him, you couldn't dislike him. You couldn't help but admire him, because even if you disagreed with him, you recognized the power of his thought, the thoroughness of his research, and the quality of his writing. And the combination was strong. And of course, if you knew him personally, there was that wonderful quality that he had, that kindness, that gentleness, that grace. And of course, if you knew what he'd been through and you could see what he'd overcome, and you saw the way he handled all that, it made him, you admired him as you probably didn't admire anyone else. I can't think of anyone on earth that I admired more than I admired Charles Krauthammer, and admire him to this day.
You speak for so many when you say that. Brit Hume, thank you. Another truly great and sincere man. Thanks. Thank you. Maybe no one in his professional life knew him and worked with him more closely than Bret Baier did. He, of course, hosts Special Report here on Fox and has for a long time, and he joins us tonight. Bret, thank you for coming on. I know how close you were to Charles, and so I hesitate even almost to ask you about it, but you're the person to talk to. Sum him up to the extent you can.
Yeah, Tucker, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I'm out of pocket today, but of all days, it's tremendously sad. Brit was really eloquent in describing Charles. He was so wise, so brilliant, but also so caring and funny. A lot of people didn't know that part of him. He was really hysterical and could get people laughing. At the commercial breaks and Special Report on the panel, he owned the room. He was also really caring. He was the person who reached out first, or one of the first, every time my son had some open heart surgery or some issue in the hospital. He wanted to know specifics. He wanted to know what the doctor said. He wanted to know. And he was like that. Not to mention all of the words and wisdom that will be his legacy on every issue under the sun.
Those who knew him, me included, were so trained not to. I mean, he wanted to so de-emphasize his own injury and wanted to shift the attention away, not just from that, but from himself. I don't think I've ever met anyone like that. I mean, he seemed to want to be judged on television, correct me if you think I'm wrong, on the strength
I think
of
you're right.
his ideas.
And you listen, it took me a long time to convince him to do that special where we sat for hours and hours and talked about his life. He, at first, was very uncomfortable about it. It surrounded, when his book came out a few years back, Things That Matter, which I commend to people because it is really amazing to see his writings in his way. We have a special tomorrow night at 9 p.m. that are his words, as well as the words of people who remember him. And I think people are really going to enjoy looking back at that.
And in a moment where everyone wants to talk about himself nonstop and about the challenges they've overcome and blah, 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 I mean, Charles was exactly the opposite. He did not want to talk about himself. I don't know if I know anyone else like that. What a wonderful quality.
Zero. He didn't want to talk about it at all. He said there are so many issues that we could talk about, and he did it so well. Tucker, he could get to the point better than anybody. He could cut through the noise. And no matter if you agreed with him or disagreed with him, he was somebody that he could just get to the point. And people really appreciated that. The panel dynamic, as you know, you were on the panel many times, was organic. It was a discussion. It wasn't planned out. That was Charles. He was an op-ed essentially every time he sat there.
Yeah, but he was the axle around which it revolved. I don't think anybody spent more time on the set with him than you did, that's for sure. Bret Baier, our condolences to you as well. And thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chuck.
We continue our commemoration of the life of Charles Krauthammer. Sincerely, a great man.
It's my job to call a folly a folly.
Charles Krauthammer, columnist, author, and Fox News commentator, lived his life telling others exactly what he thought.
You're betraying your whole life if you don't say what you think, and you don't say it honestly and bluntly.
It was that quality that brought Charles to Fox News Channel during Brit Hume's tenure as anchor.
This is not a man designed for television. You look at him and say, this is not a potential TV star. In fact, he became a huge star, even I would almost say a megastar on this channel. And it was the sheer force of his intellect and the power of his thinking. And on top of that, there was a gentleness about him personally that if he disagreed with you, you never felt attacked. He just disagreed with you.
It was always unspoken on the panel that he was always the leader because of his delivery, his intellect.
Special Report stage manager Mary Pat Dennert was on set with Charles every night for years.
It was kind of an ongoing joke on the panel that Bret Baier has a signal when people need to wrap up. I give him 30, so Bret puts his arm out. And Charles was on the show forever, and we always laughed that I don't think he paid attention to that once. He had something to say, he was going to say it. No time constraints were going to control him on that.
Born in 1950s New York to Jewish parents who left World War II-era Europe, Charles' father raised his son to value the pursuit of knowledge.
His motto for us was, I want you to know everything. I want you to learn everything. You don't have to do everything, but you got to know everything. He thought that was part of life.
The family lived in Montreal and summered at their cottage in Long Beach, New York.
It was a paradisical childhood. My brother and I were inseparable. He always insisted I be included, so I got used to being around the big boys and taking the slings and arrows, and that's how you get toughened up.
As a senior at McGill University in Canada, Krauthammer became captivated by political journalism. He applied to medical school to appease his family and was accepted to Harvard. But Krauthammer put off attending and enrolled at Oxford instead. It was there that he met fellow student from Australia, Robin Trethewey, who would later become his wife. Charles reversed course and headed back to the U.S. to attend Harvard. Why did you choose psychiatry?
I was looking for something halfway between the reality of medicine and the elegance, if you like, of philosophy. So psychiatry was the obvious thing.
It was there that one unexpected moment, a tragic diving accident, changed Charles' life forever.
It just hit at precisely the angle where all the force was transmitted to one spot, and that is the cervical vertebra, which severed the spinal cord.
When did you realize that the accident was life-altering?
The second it happened.
Despite his permanent paralysis, Charles astounded his professors and classmates by graduating on time, near the top of his class. Ultimately, he decided the field wasn't for him, a career reversal he joked about on Fox decades later.
I'm a psychiatrist in remission, doing very well. I haven't had a relapse in 25 years.
In 1978, Krauthammer headed to Washington, D.C. for a government job.
I thought, once I'm in Washington, isn't that where they do politics? One thing will lead to another.
Robert encouraged him to follow his dreams, and he soon landed at the left-leaning New Republic magazine, just as the Reagan administration took office.
So help me God.
Krauthammer found himself agreeing with the new president and questioning his own feelings about the Democratic Party.
I ended up supporting just about every element of the Reagan foreign policy.
Months after Reagan's re-election, Krauthammer penned the phrase, "the Reagan Doctrine," in a provocative Time magazine column, and the name stuck.
He created the Reagan Doctrine. Nobody had heard of it. Charles put together a piece and dubbed it, and I've read it many times, and it just holds up so well. I think Charles discovered then that there really was a lot to Reagan.
But it would take years before Charles fully embraced domestic conservative ideals.
It took me about a decade. I was skeptical of tax cuts. I was skeptical of smaller government at the beginning. And then by the end of the 80s, I had begun to change.
In 1985, his son Daniel was born. And 2 years later, Charles won the biggest honor in journalism, the Pulitzer Prize. But it was the events of September 11, 2001, that brought a more forceful tone to his commentary and a regular spot on the Special Report panel. Over the years, Charles became an audience favorite.
The biggest error that we make is to lose the damn war because we refuse to recognize who the enemy is and what it requires. For God's sake, why do you have to talk about that? The mourning is over, the Shiva is done, and if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic. I think it'll snow in hell before the DOJ is going to go after her. We all were expecting it. It didn't happen. That was the dog that didn't bark.
Despite all of his accomplishments, awards, and high-profile endorsements, Krauthammer was always humble and at times uneasy with the influence his words held.
I think about it, and I find it worrisome. The reason is that when I was totally unknown, I could say anything I damn well pleased.
This program is brought to you by Harvoni.
You've heard a lot recently about the sinister influence of foreign countries on our government. Our enemies abroad, we are told, take advantage of our political system to hurt us and help themselves. Well, we're right to be worried about that. It's actually happening. The chief offender is not Russia, though. It's Mexico. Mexican authorities encourage illegal immigration into our country. They publish instructions showing illegal aliens how to evade deportation from here. They guide migrant caravans north on their way to America. They send their poorest people here because it's cheaper than taking care of them there. America is now Mexico's social safety net, and that's a very good deal for the Mexican ruling class. In 10 days, Mexican voters will select a new president. The favorite in that race as of tonight is a man named Andrés Manuel López Obrador. In a speech on Tuesday, López Obrador said that as president, his administration will, quote, defend all the migrants in the American continent and all the migrants in the world who must leave their towns and find a life in the United States. He added that everybody in this world has, and we're quoting now, a human right to enter our country, the United States of America. And when you think about it, you can see why he feels that way, because in a recent speech, he also admitted that the Mexican economy is dependent upon remittances from the U.S. to Mexico. By the way, López Obrador has suggested that he may give amnesty to Mexico's drug cartels. Those are the people who produce and import the opioids that have destroyed the center of this country, the ones that kill tens of thousands of Americans every year. The fentanyl, that comes from Mexico. people who produce that and kill Americans off scot-free. But it turns out Lopez Obrador's constituency isn't just in his own country. It's here. That's odd, because we're told over and over again that immigrants are eager to assimilate here in America, but apparently Lopez Obrador didn't get that memo. Just last year, he campaigned for the presidency of Mexico in more than a dozen American cities, since Mexican citizens living abroad are still allowed to vote back home. Jorge Ramos is one of those Mexican citizens, as well as Univision anchor, and he joins us tonight. Jorge, thank you very much for coming on. Tell me a little more about this right of all the people in the world to come to the United States. Where does that right come from?
Well, let me just say right at the beginning, I'm an independent journalist. I don't speak for the Mexican government, nor for Lopez Obrador or any other three presidential candidates. But Lopez Obrador, he's ahead of the polls right now, Tucker. He's reaching almost 50%. He's a leftist candidate. He's 64. And what he has said is that he's vowing to be a president for the 130 million Mexicans in Mexico and for the about 12 million Mexicans here in the United States. So don't expect Lopez Obrador to be a spineless and weak president like Peña Nieto. It's going to be a completely different relationship between Lopez Obrador, if he wins, and President Donald Trump.
It sounds that way, but why? But I'm unlike you. I'm an American. I only vote in this country. I only can. I'm only a citizen of this country. And so why would I or any of the other American citizens watching tonight think that it's a good thing that a president of another country is declaring that the world has a right to move here? That's a hostile act aimed at us. Why would we be for that?
I don't know why he said that, but what I can tell you is that he wants to protect the 12 million Mexicans living here and the 35 million people in this country from Mexican origin. So it's going to be different. You remember with Enrique Peña Nieto, the current president, he invited then candidate Donald Trump to Los Pinos, the Mexican White House, and Mexicans were outraged by doing that. Lopez Obrador is going to be completely different. As a matter of fact, just recently, Lopez Obrador said that this policy of family separation is racist. So in other words, if he becomes president, and it would be December 1st, it would be completely different than Peña Nieto with Donald Trump.
Okay, so we're getting another racism lecture from a rich white Mexican ruling class member. Okay, just want to clarify that. But let me just ask you this. Wait, no, but hold on. To get racism lectures from any Mexican official who preside over one of the most racist countries in the world, most Americans don't understand that. I've spent enough time there to know that that's absurd.
Racism. It is racism what has happened with the family separation. But it is racism. Let me just say why. I mean, what are the number of Americans, kids in cages right now? It's 0. And what's the number of Central American and Mexican kids in cages or detention centers? 2,300.
Okay. Nobody is being detained because of the color of his skin. This isn't Mexico. In Mexico, they're being people of Indian background can't rise to levels of prominence because it's too racist, as you know. So again, Mexican citizens are in no position to lecture Americans about racism. Let's just start there. But let me ask you this. I'm kind of confused
it is racism what is happening in this country.
Of course it's not racism. That's called demagoguery. But let me ask you this. We're told, including by people like you,
and torture.
That's absurd. Well, let's move past it very quickly to ask the obvious question, which is, if Mexicans come here to assimilate and become Americans, which is what we're always being told, they want a part of the American dream, then why is the guy running for the president of Mexico campaigning among them? It doesn't sound like they're assimilating. It sounds like there's Mexican citizens extracting what they can from our country.
Well, there are two things here. First of all, under Mexican law, Mexicans living abroad, they are allowed to vote. And many, including me, we're going to be doing that on July 1st.
But
and
why
the
would they? If they believe in America, and if they're assimilated into America, why would they still be voting?
You can actually assimilate,
and vote in a foreign
you can
election?
be part of the United States and still believe that you can participate politically in Mexico. Those are the laws. They can do it. But you wouldn't
participate in an election. Hold on. But you wouldn't participate in an election unless you had skin in the game, unless you felt that politician was representing you. But if you were an American and you really identify with the United States, then what they do in Mexico doesn't really concern you. So I'm confused. You can't be assimilated in America and still be voting in a foreign election. That's just, it doesn't make any sense.
But it does, because you would expect, in this case, the president of Mexico to defend Mexican immigrants or Central American or Latin American immigrants if something happens to them. And we just have the crisis right now at the border. So you would expect the Mexican president to defend you if something happens to you in the United States, of course.
But why wouldn't he want those people? Look, if those are his people, wait, then I'm even more confused. If those are his people, his citizens, he's representing them, he's soliciting their votes, which he is doing, why doesn't he want them to live in Mexico?
Well, many of them left for many different reasons. And as you know, immigration has to do with supply and demand. And if there are jobs for them here in the United States, and there are not enough jobs for them in Mexico.
Net. Oh, I get it.
Well, not only
just outsource your poor people to America. We're going to figure out how to do that to Mexico.
Immigrants contribute billions of dollars to the economy, including Mexican immigrants.
Right. That's why Mexico doesn't want them.
You know that.
Okay.
The American Academy of Sciences just concluded that.
Absolutely, absolutely true. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Well, in its desire for open borders, the left has gone to war with the basics of civilized democratic discourse. Why aren't leaders on the left doing anything to tone down the rhetoric? Because it is out of control. We'll give you examples next. Frenzy over family separation at the border seems to have peaked, at least for the moment. Now that the smoke is settling, we're learning what we always learn in these things. It turns out the issue was a lot more complicated than they were telling us on TV. The policy in question, for example, is not at all new. Watch as Senator Tammy Baldwin tries to explain away that fact.
As so many people in this country are certainly outraged by the cages and the thermal blankets and the facilities housing these kids, you know, they were all there in 2014 under President Obama. And my question to you, Senator Baldwin, is did you speak up against them then?
You know, on this issue that we get into a moment where we're making progress, and then when it stalls, we turn around.
So the people in charge were misrepresenting the facts. They were lying to you. No surprise there. What's different, though, and it is different, is how they did it this time. There was a harshness to the moral panic that most of us hadn't seen before. The usual people yelling on TV were saying things that adults didn't used to say in public even a few months ago. They seemed hysterical, crazed, nihilistic. Something had changed. It was creepy. In case you've forgotten, here's a selection from MSNBC.
What the Trump administration has entered into is a war of terror with the cartels in Central America, in which they have now said, we must terrorize people more than the cartels are terrorizing people in their home country so they don't come here. And that is a bidding war that is ghastly and a moral abomination, and one I pray that we cannot possibly win.
3 tender age shelters in South Texas. Lawyers and medical providers just, I think I'm going to have to hand this off. Yeah. Sorry. That does it for us tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow. Now it is time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell, where he is live in Brownsville, Texas.
So according to MSNBC, Trump is literally worse than the Mexican drug cartels, the ones that behead people. Needless to say, he's also a racist.
I do not believe that President Trump would implement this at the Canadian border and do this to white children.
The president appears to have a blind spot as it relates to compassion or the lack thereof for communities of color, for vulnerable communities, for people of diversity.
Sexism, racism, white supremacy, thuggery, bigotry, along with complicit men and women within the administration.
What you're watching there is propaganda. Over time, it's effective, and of course, that's why they do it. But what does it do to the country? Well, just ask the DHS Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen. She tried to have dinner the other night at a restaurant on 14th Street in downtown Washington, and here's what happened.
Shame! 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 Shame!
So one of the Red Guards you just heard screaming is a current, it turns out, Department of Justice employee named Allison Hrabar. Hrabar was proud to be there. As she later told a reporter, quote, Anyone who sees Kirstjen Nielsen at dinner, anyone who sees anyone who works at DHS and ICE at dinner, can confront them like this. That's what we hope this will inspire people to do. In other words, if we disagree with your political views, you no longer have rights, including the right to go to outside or eat in restaurants. Is that really a precedent that we're comfortable with establishing? Well, yes, explained Jessica Valenti of The Guardian. She tweeted that, quote, Nielsen should never be able to show her face in public again. Over at the Washington Post, Christine Emba agreed with that. Girl, bye, she tweeted, adding that, quote, I'm frankly astonished she dares show her face in public. Well, this is the definition of mob justice. MSNBC anchors applaud it. Nielsen's real sin, they explained, was daring to eat Mexican food.
As we go to break, activists heckled Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. She made the very tone-deaf, Ivanka-like decision to dine at a Mexican restaurant last night.
Over on CNN, Ana Navarro had the same response, quote, are there no Norwegian restaurants in Washington, D.C., she asked. In other words, when it comes to eating, stick to your own race. Oh, stop the race mixing, mean DHS secretary. Keep in mind there was a time not so long ago when liberals opposed segregation. There was also a time when liberals supported nonviolence. No longer. Splinter, a website owned by Univision, posted White House aide Stephen Miller's personal cell phone number. The right to privacy doesn't apply to those who oppose the left. Sam Levine, meanwhile, he's a professor at NYU, put personal information about ICE employees on the internet. His readers got the message. But in case that message was too subtle, here's actor Peter Fonda on Twitter encouraging his fellow progressives, quote, get the addresses of the ICE agents and surround their homes in protest. We should find out what schools their children go to and surround the schools in protest. We don't have to take the agents' kids. We only need to surround their schools and scare the bleep out of them and worry the bleep out of the agents. We need to scare the bleep out of them, exclamation point. Need to make their children worry now. And then Fonda wrote this about the current DHS secretary, quote, Kirstjen Nielsen is a lying gash who should be put in a cage and poked at by passersby. The gash should be pilloried in Lafayette Square naked and whipped by passersby while being filmed for posterity. End quote. Just another day on progressive Twitter. So where's all of this going? You know the answer to that. You can feel where it's going. The question is, how did we get here? That's not complicated either. Over the past couple of days, Trump administration officials have been compared to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis dozens of times on CNN and MSNBC. What's the effect of that? Think about it for a second. If you really believed Nazis were taking power in your country, what would you do? What wouldn't you do? You would have an obligation to act, to use force. Maybe you'd start by screaming at people in restaurants, but you wouldn't stop there. You might try to assassinate Republican members of Congress at a baseball practice. Who knows what you would do? Hurting Nazis wouldn't make you a bad person. It would make you a good person, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is how countries fall apart, when one side ceases to see the other side as human. Progressive leaders could do a lot to cool the tone here. They don't even try. Where's Chuck Schumer in all this? How about Nancy Pelosi? They're okay with Republican officials being threatened by mobs in restaurants in public? They haven't said otherwise. Apparently they are. And what about Jeff Zucker at CNN or Andy Lack at NBC? They're okay with their contributors calling fellow Americans Nazis on TV? Maybe they're fine with that. They're certainly benefiting from it, for now anyway, until things fall completely apart. And at this pace, it won't be long. Joining us now to make sense of all of this is our friend Dave Rubin. So, Dave, it seems to me, look, I host a debate show. I have for many years. I'm for debate. I'm for contentious debate. I just had a contentious debate. But calling people Nazis does seem to cross some kind of line, because if you really thought Nazis were taking over your country, wouldn't you have a moral obligation to hurt them?
Yes, you would. And Tucker, as you know, on my show for the last couple years, I am someone that comes from the left. I was a progressive. Yes. I still consider myself liberal, although that word has been hijacked over the past couple of years. But the issues that I've been calling out on the left are the issues that you're talking about right there. Those quotes from the MSNBC host, the clips that you just played, this is what the arguments of the left have been whittled down to. Everyone, in your conversation just now with Jorge Ramos, everything comes down to everyone else being a racist or a bigot or somehow acting in prejudice. And this is a horrific, horrific way to enter an argument in the public space, because then you keep calling people Nazis, then you say it's okay to punch Nazis, and now you can actually punch everybody, you can dox people, you can do whatever you want to them. And that's sort of, I mean, if you ask me, really, if you followed what I've done for the last couple of years, this was the obvious outcome of all of this. And very quickly on the Nazi part of this, you know, the Nazis, beyond exterminating millions and millions of people, they did not let their own citizens leave the country, right? They didn't let the Jews leave. They actually put their own citizens in concentration camps and in, to slaughter their own people. This wasn't people that couldn't come into their country. This is a massive difference. And of course, there's a zillion other massive differences. But the hyperbole is so over the top at this point that it just doesn't seem like anyone's going to rein it in. You're right. Where are the leaders? Actually, Chuck Schumer, what did he say a day or two ago? He wants to make versus this awful machine. And I don't see any way it's going to stop it. Just the last couple of days on social media, you know, Twitter can be quite horrific. I know you know that, Tucker. But the last couple of days have just been an absolute toxic nightmare. And for the few of us that want to engage in honest conversation, and look, Tucker, you and I, we have a bunch of political differences, but we can always do this respectfully. And that's being lost. But, you know, the silver lining to this is there's a lot of people watching you. There's a lot of people watching me. And I think there is a growing counterbalance to this. But they're just not as hysterical as everybody else.
Yeah, these people are playing with fire, and they ought to slow down, because people can, I mean, this is not moving in the right direction. Dave, thank you very much for your perspective.
Thanks, Tucker.
Democratic politicians used to quietly pursue open borders. Now they're openly calling for open borders. We'll talk to a congressional candidate who wants to abolish ICE. Next. Well, as the left's rage against borders grows more intense, its policy demands are changing too. Across the country, politicians and activists are suddenly demanding the total abolition of ICE, presumably an end to all immigration enforcement. Matt Hagman is a Democratic congressional candidate in the state of Florida. He just put out this campaign ad. Watch this.
ICE under Trump targets children. In Congress, I'll work to close ICE down. We can protect our borders without being cruel to kids. Donna Shalala, she's had her chance. It's time for a new day. I'm Matt Hagman, and I approve this message.
Matt Hagman joins us tonight. Matt, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker. Great to be here.
Let me say, and I mean this with sincerity, I appreciate your honesty. I like when people say what they think, and you have, so good for you.
Thank you.
So you want to get rid of ICE. Any other law enforcement agencies we should get rid of? How about the Coast Guard?
No. And by the way, Tucker, going at the break, you said that I'm for open borders. I am not. And I am for abolishing ICE, because ICE has been undermining American values. ICE has been tearing apart families. This is not who we are. But while I say that we need to abolish ICE, I am still for strong borders. And we still have Customs and Border Patrol, and can still have limited and humane immigration enforcement in this country. Let's remember, ICE is something that's only been here.
Let me ask you a question.
If I might,
someone
Tucker,
shows up.
ICE has been. Sure. ICE has been here for 15 years, Tucker. It's a 15-year experiment. Right. Prior to that, we were able to enforce our immigration laws humanely and in a limited way. We need to get back to doing
So the laws haven't changed much. I mean, just to dig down, since you're getting the ICE question a little more deeply, is there something immoral about the ICE employees? A lot of Democrats have compared them to Nazis. Do you think they're bad people?
That's absurd. That's absurd, Tucker. We're talking about ICE's
It's not absurd because you're not calling for. But hold on, it's not absurd. So ICE carries out the laws passed by the Congress. You want to serve in the Congress, but you're not calling, I notice, for different laws. You're saying you want to get rid of this one specific agency, but keep other agencies to patrol the border in some, as you said, limited way. What's specifically wrong with ICE? There's something wrong with the people
ICE
there.
Is out of hand. ICE going on buses and asking for papers. ICE now going to schools and churches and taking people off the street. The other day was just reading about someone.
Why do you think they're doing that?
That's the point, and that we created this standalone
but what's the answer? I mean, you're the one calling. Wait, hold on. I'm here to learn from you. You want to get rid of them, but why do you think they're doing this stuff?
ICE is out of hand in its approach in terms of how before, when we had enforcement, it was both.
Wait, so it says
we had an agency. If I might,
No, you may not, because you already have. I want to get you to answer this question, which is, why do you think they're that way? You say that they're doing these horrible things. Why do you think they're doing those horrible things?
Because it's been an agency set up solely around enforcement, rather than set up, and it was a setup in 2003, rather than an agency set up to govern and enforce immigration rules in this country. Tucker, we are a country of immigrants.
Wait, what is that? Hold on, wait. I'm sorry. Maybe it's my fault for wanting specific answers, but what does that mean? It's a law enforcement agency that shouldn't just enforce the law.
Take, for example, what we had before under. Take, for example, what we had before under the previous.
No, I want to talk about ICE. You want to abolish ICE? Help me here. Help me understand your position.
I do want to abolish ICE.
You say they should do things other than enforce the law. What should those things be?
Tucker, a way we had it before, under INS, something like that. We can enforce our immigration laws through another mechanism, not ICE, which is out of hand, which is now.
But what's wrong with ICE? Matt, I'm trying. Look, if you're ever in Washington, call me. I would love to hear more about this because I'm still confused. But thank you for coming on. I appreciate that.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you, Tucker.
An advisor to the Trump presidential campaign thinks he may have been targeted by an FBI informant in 2016, and he's got some evidence to suggest that he was. That advisor joins us with details next. Well, FBI spying in the 2016 election could be even more far-reaching than we already knew. Trump advisor Michael Caputo says that in 2016, he and Roger Stone were approached by a man under the alias Henry Greenberg, who asked for $2 million in exchange for dirt on Hillary Clinton. Greenberg, documents indicate, has also worked as an FBI informant over the span of 17 years. Caputo thinks he may have been informing when he approached the campaign. Michael Caputo joins us tonight. Michael, thank you very much for coming on. So this is one of those stories that's tantalizing because the facts that we know for certain, or seem to know for certain, point right to the FBI. This guy clearly, he listed the FBI and an FBI agent on an immigration application. So he apparently was working in some capacity for the FBI, which probably means he was not working for the Russian government. Right.
Right.
We know that.
In fact, we do. And when I was interviewed by the Mueller investigation on May 2nd, I exposed or answered about this Greenberg approach in response to a perjury trap, and that really angered my interviewer. And his emotional response was a red flag to me. They seemed to know more about it than I did. So when I got out of my Mueller investigation interview, my GoFundMe for my legal fund went through the roof, and I used some of those funds to hire investigators in the United States and Russia to find out more about Henry Greenberg. And we quickly found out through an Immigration and Naturalization Service filing that he made in 2015 that he signed under oath saying that he was an FBI informant for 17 years, also here in Iran and in North Korea, and he provided 14 different FBI informant visas as proof of that. So I quickly dug into every aspect of his life. You can see all of it at democratdossier.org. Henry Greenberg goes by 4 other names. He's been in jail 10 years in Russia, committed assault with a deadly weapon in Los Angeles, served time in prison here, and before, the FBI had thrown him out of the country, deported him in 2000. But somehow he's back, and he's living under FBI visas, and the question isn't, was he an FBI informant? The question is, did he take time off from his long career as an FBI informant to have lunch off the clock and meet Roger Stone? That's the question. He's only here because he's working for the FBI. Otherwise, they'd have deported him again.
So this would be, if what you're saying is true, this would be the second verified instance of the Obama administration's FBI spying on the Trump campaign. How can you find out if that, in fact, was what was happening?
2 different things. It could be proof that this investigation from the Obama administration began 2 months earlier than they're actually admitting to right now, as early as May instead of July. So we understand that our investigation has emboldened investigators in Congress, Republican investigators. We believe it's very easy for them, if they can get any documents out of the DOJ, to find out if Henry Greenberg, who goes by many other names, Henry Okniansky is his FBI informant name.
Right.
If he was under another FBI informant visa in 2016.
And they should find out.
If he
and
was,
they should.
It's a
'Cause
jackpot.
I don't care if nobody thinks it's a big deal. It was a big deal. Michael Caputo, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Tell us what you find out, if you would. We'll be back in just a moment.